Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. The budget's unprecedented tax relief has caused a lot of concern, but it's also created considerable excitement. That's one of the key issues we shall discuss today. First of all, are the beneficiaries the middle class or are they the elite? Will this boost consumption and demand and growth, or is that still in doubt? And given that only 31 million people pay taxes, what does this mean for the rest of the country who don't necessarily share in the relief? And finally, if the slowdown in growth is structural rather than cyclical, has the budget positioned itself to tackle that problem? And has the budget positioned the country on the road to Viksit Bharat? Those are the key issues I shall raise today with my guest. He's India's former Chief Statistician and the present Country Director of the International Growth Centre, Pronab Sen. Professor Sen, let's begin by talking about that particular aspect of the budget that's attracted the most attention. I'm talking of the unprecedented tax relief. It's been presented as a reward to the middle class. It's often been called a gift to the middle class. But given that only 8 crore people file income tax returns every year, and within that, only 3.1 crore actually pay tax, is this a benefit for the middle class or for the elite?
Oh, this is very much for the elite. I mean, when you think of the term middle class, and there's no hard and fast definition, you would be talking about somewhere between, let's say, 50%, above 50% to, let's say, about 90%. That would be middle. We are talking about the top couple of percents.
So this is wrongly characterized by the government, indeed by the media, as a benefit for the middle class. It's actually a benefit for India's elite.
Yeah, if you think of the top 10% of income earners in the country as the elite, yes, it is for the elite.
Now, the second key question is, what will these 31 million people who are getting this income tax relief do with the money they get? Will they spend it? Will they save it? Or might they use it to pay off loans like EMIs and gold loans? I take it, depending upon how they utilize this money, we will be able to work out the impact on the economy.
It's going to be a mixed bag. Towards the lower end, I think there will be paying off of loans. There will be some increase in consumption. But at the upper end, nothing much at all.
Completely saved?
Pretty much. It's not so much saved as invested. I mean, they would be building up reserves for the future.
And to the extent loans are paid off, will that be productive for the economy or would it make no difference at all?
Well, that's difficult to say. If the loans are being paid off, what you're doing in effect is you're providing the banking system with more funds to lend to more productive activities.
Provided they're willing to lend.
Provided that happens. So that's not entirely clear. Much depends upon what the nature of the demand facing the banking sector is and what the proclivities of the banking sector are.
So how productive for the economy this money will turn out to be depends entirely on A, how it's used, and B, what the banks do if the loans are being paid off.
That's right.
So there are question marks there.
Well, there are question marks because it can work either way. The banks can actually lend the money for consumption, in which case it makes no substantive difference, or it can lend the money for investment purposes, in which case it's going to take time for it to show up in demand.
Third, if this money which comes into the hands of taxpayers is actually used almost entirely for consumption, even in those circumstances, how much of an impact would it make on consumption, demand and growth? Mir Sharma, writing in the Business Standard yesterday, said, and I'm quoting him, long-term studies in the United States have found little evidence that tax cuts or tax reforms since 1980 have impacted the long-term growth rate significantly.
Well, long-term growth rates are unlikely to be affected because long-term growth rates don't depend that much upon consumption demand. It certainly has a role to play. What it depends upon is what is happening to productive capacities in the economy. So it's not fair to gauge the effects of a tax cut using long-run data.
Short term?
This is short to medium term. And yes, it could have an effect. But having said that, the question is, where are these funds being found from? So we have a situation where the government has reduced the fiscal deficit, and significantly, which in and of itself is a contractionary measure, right? Now, in addition to that, you've done an income tax cut. So presumably cuts have been made on the expenditure side, which we have to take into account and ask the question, how would that affect consumption demand? And if you look at the budget numbers are very clear. Almost all social sector spending have been cut. Now, the social sector spending, whether you're talking about health, education, social security, nets of various kinds, MGNREGA, the works, all of those were funds which essentially benefited the poorer sections and the lower middle class. If those have been cut, then the consumption effects would be negative. And that may well outweigh any consumption growth increase that you've given from the income tax side. But then there's a compositional problem. The compositional problem is that the lower and the lower middle class consume a different set of products than the uppers. So you're going to have parts of the economy which will see demand growth, and that's a limited part. A lot of that may actually be for imports. So you might not see any increase in the demand for domestic goods and services. But on the lower hand, we are probably going to see a reduction in demand. So the net effect is unlikely to be an increase in consumption demand.
Is this why the economic survey, when it's forecasting what it believes will be growth next year, is suggesting a range 6.3 to 6.8, which is almost identical to what we're forecast to achieve this year? This year we're forecast to achieve 6.4. Next year it's between 6.3 and 6.8, and if it comes in at the low end, 6.3, it will be lower than this year. Is this why the economic survey is not suggesting any great demand and growth next year?
Well, no, I think what the economic survey is doing is recognizing the fact that on a medium to long-term sustainable basis, we will be in the 6 to 6.5% range. And we are simply going back. So we were above it, now we are tapering back to where we will be in the longer run. I think that's what it's doing.
This is what you called, when we last spoke in November, India's normal natural rate of growth.
That's right, as things stand.
And that normal natural growth is around 6.4%.
Well, somewhere between 6.5. So 6.4%, my estimate is towards the upper end, but you could do all kinds of things wrong
but the
and
most
be
important
significantly
thing,
below it.
But the most important thing you're saying is that even after this unprecedented income tax relief, the impact on demand and therefore the impact on growth will not be such that growth next year will be sizably different to growth this year. It's predicted by the economic survey to be roughly the same.
Yes.
Let me go one step further. Prasanajit Bose, writing in the Hindu yesterday, says that the 3.1 crore who get income tax relief are approximately 25% of the salaried workforce. The question is, what happens to the remaining 75%? The economic survey suggests that between 2017-18 and 2024-25, real monthly wages of self-employed workers fell by 9.1%, and those of salaried workers fell by 6.4%. So this cohort, this 75%, have not only seen their salaries shrink over the last 6-7 years, but they also still have to contend with inflation at 5.2% and food inflation pretty close to 8%.
No, I think what he's talking about is inclusive of the inflation component.
Quite right. But next year they will still face inflation.
They will still face
right,
inflation,
and they will
yes,
still face food inflation next year,
right.
Which means that their capacity to increase demand and consume is going to shrink. It's not going to grow.
Well, that depends on what happens. Look, if growth does take place, supposing we do grow at 6%, right, that is going to increase purchasing power. The real question is how is it being distributed? So we've seen a phase that has happened in the immediate past where corporate profits have gone up very strongly, corporate wage bill has not. Wages are stagnant, if not declining in certain cases. You've got the MSME, where you always had a very large proportion of your regular salaried workers who are still trying to crawl back up a little bit. They are in no position to give high wage increases, and given the level of unemployment and underemployment in the country, they don't need to. So on the distributional front, things don't look good.
Does that also suggest that this unprecedented income tax relief is going to increase inequalities?
It certainly will.
And perhaps fairly sizably, because some people will be saving money because they're not paying tax. Some will be not paying tax at all.
Yes.
Whereas others have not only seen their salary shrink over the last 6-7 years, but will continue to face inflation and food inflation, and therefore their purchasing capacity will not be great, whereas those who've got the tax relief will have a much better purchasing capacity. So inequality between them will be increasing.
Yeah. Now the entire hope resides in being able to revive growth, get more growth dynamism, so that the economy generates more jobs, more
But the economic survey is already telling us the growth is going to be no more dynamic next year than it is this.
Karan, 6.3 to 6.8 is not bad. Frankly, I mean, it's not what we need. We need 7.5 to 8.
If we achieve that 6.3 to 6.8, last year the economic survey was talking about 6.5 to 7, and we've come in way below even 6.5. We've come in at 6.4. So last year the economic survey overestimated the growth projection. They may be doing it again.
No, they will. I'd be surprised if the economic survey didn't, because the economic survey is supposed to put a positive spin on the government story. So there will be a certain amount of overestimation there.
Tell me, one more question. What does this tax relief for 31 million people mean for the rest of the country's 1.4 billion population? Can tax relief for 31 million have any boost on the consumption and demand of the rest of the country?
Well, it's not 31 million. It's 31 million taxpayers, which means probably about 120 million human beings.
On the basis of 5 people per family.
4 people per family. So 120 out of 140. So you're talking about the top 10%.
So what impact will that have on the rest of the 1.4 billion population?
Well, as I said, that what it will have is going to widen disparities. And since you're cutting social services, you may actually be affecting upward mobility at the lower segments, particularly the lowest segments.
So you're increasing inequality while reducing the upward mobility prospects of the lower segments.
Yes.
As far as the lower segments are concerned, this sounds unfair.
Yes, but they won't even realize it.
Because they won't be aware of it, or because it will happen?
That's right. The point is that money that the government gives you is recognized. Money that the government takes away from you is recognized. But services that the government is providing, that is just taken for granted. Whether it improves or gets worse, it doesn't seem to reflect on the government in any significant way.
So, in other words, people may not be complaining about it, but the reality is that inequality will increase and
Yes.
prospects for mobility for the lower segments will diminish.
Yes.
That is the reality. Whether
That's the
people
problem.
complain or not is another matter.
That's it.
And they may not complain because they may not realize it.
That's right.
But if it were pointed out to them, they would complain.
They may or may not. Karan, one of the most peculiar things in India, for instance, is people complain constantly about inflation, right? But we don't complain about unemployment. We are one of the few countries where you have huge underemployment and nobody complains about it, because people don't see that as something that the government owes to them. They see it as their own failure.
And the same thing will be happening here.
The same thing will be happening here.
In other words, they will internalize the problem and blame themselves,
Right.
not the government.
That's right.
Which is why the government is very lucky. Elsewhere, the government would be blamed. It doesn't happen in India.
Yeah, that's right.
Which leads to two further questions. Has she, to begin with, overdone the level of tax exemption? Both Ratin Roy and Swaminathan Iyer point out that the tax exemption limit of 12 lakhs is 5 times India's per capita income. In the United States, the per capita income is $82,000. The tax exemption limit is 1/6 of that, just 14,600. In Pakistan, I'm told the tax exemption limit is just 1.87 lakhs, which is roughly 1/7 of India's tax exemption limit. So has she overdone, has she raised the tax exemption limit too high?
Karan, I'm conflicted. I'm a beneficiary. Has she raised it too high? In a sense, yes. My personal preference would be that we did need to raise the cutoffs in the slab sizes. But that should have been done just keeping in mind what the inflation had done. And that would not justify such a large correction. So yes, I think there is a bit of overdoing. So we have to split it up between essentially adjusting for inflation that we've had in the past
And over-adjusting.
and then over-adjusting. The over-adjusting part of it isn't that large.
Let me put this to you. At a time when economists are concerned about expanding the tax base by raising the tax exemption limit from 7 lakhs to 12 lakhs in one fell swoop, this government has very substantially contracted the tax base. As a result, 1 crore people now will not be paying tax at all, and the number of people paying tax will now be reduced from 31 million to 21 million.
Is that right?
Swaminathan Iyer, writing in the Economic Times on the 2nd, said this may be good politics, but it ain't good economics.
No, look, I don't even see how it's good politics.
It's neither.
I mean, 31 million people would be happier, but they wouldn't be ecstatic. 10 million would be ecstatic. But the remaining 21 million would just about be keeping pace with what inflation had eroded. So, what's the good politics in it? There are good optics in it. So there may be a feel-good factor. So the Indian middle class is feeling chuffed. But when they actually sit down and work out things, They shouldn't.
So in your eyes, this is neither good economics nor good politics.
No, it may well be good politics.
But you're not sure.
I am no one to judge.
Tell me this, to what extent will what's called the Trump effect either nullify or at least diminish the beneficial impact of the tax relief?
Well, Karan, at the end of the day, the effect of any budget, really how quickly it goes through the system, what level of effect it has, really depends upon how much confidence consumers and investors have about the future. Typically what happens is when people are confident about the future, then they will tend to spend more simply because they expect their earnings to be higher in the coming years. So they can afford to spend more now. If they are not certain about the future, then they will tend to save.
And what do you see in the present circumstances?
The whole Trump effect makes the world so much more uncertain. As it is, if you really look at the past 7 years or so, the level of confidence among Indian consumers and investors hasn't been great. Both have been subdued, private investment as well as consumption demand, other than that little blip we had post-COVID. So our confidence levels were low. Trump is simply going to add to it. Just the global uncertainties have become so much worse.
Which means that even if people have more money in their pockets, they may be reluctant to spend it, they may choose to save it or pay off loans instead.
Yeah, what they will try to do is to essentially prepare for any curveballs that the world may throw at us later.
Quite right. They will therefore basically be very careful about spending.
Very careful about spending, yes.
And since her intention was to get people to spend, to create demand, to create growth, she may not achieve that intention.
Very likely.
And there's also another danger which you pointed out earlier, I'm bringing it up now. There's a danger that the richer section of those who've got tax relief might actually choose imports. And since import tariffs have come down and the average tariff has come down from roughly 13.5% to 10.6%, imports are becoming cheaper. And if that upper section is going to choose imports, it might be easier for them to do so.
Oh yes, it's not just direct imports. The tendency would be to consume things which have a high import content. So you may not be actually importing it directly yourself. So you could be going out to a fancy restaurant which is importing its ingredients. So you may not see it in terms of the direct imports of consumer goods.
But indirect.
But indirect can also be there, and that's usually pretty large.
So we're talking about two interesting consequences, or three. One, inequality as a result of the tax relief will increase. The capacity of the lower sections for upward mobility will diminish. Secondly, we're pointing out that the ability of people to go in for imports, particularly the richer section who got tax relief, will be greater. And finally, as you pointed out, there is also a danger that people may not actually spend the money if uncertainty because of the Trump effect grows. Yes. People may choose to save or simply pay off loans.
Yes.
If all three happen, she's not going to get the impact on demand that she's hoping for. She's not going to get the growth potential that she's hoping for.
No, in any case, I think if I take the budget in its totality, you shouldn't expect much demand growth. Because as I said, you've had a cut in the fiscal deficit, which is contractionary. You had a cut in social spending of all kinds, which again means a decrease in consumption by the lower classes. And you've got an increase in the upper middle class and upper class from the tax break. The net effect of all of this is still contractionary.
And that means that the impact on growth will be limited.
Will be very limited, yes.
Very limited.
Yes.
I'm going to use that as a headline. The impact of growth of the unprecedented tax relief will be very limited.
Yes.
That's not what she's looking for, and that's certainly not what she's hoping for. She's going to be a
I
disappointed
think
lady.
she's trying to boost up confidence. As I said, that is the unmeasurable element in all of this. That can you boost confidence in investors and consumers?
But in all the interviews that she's given, and she's done several by now, and in all the newspaper comment, there is the great belief that this unprecedented tax relief is going to boost demand, which in turn will boost growth. And we're hoping that we can go back to levels of growth in excess of 7%. That is not going to happen, full stop.
Very unlikely.
So to the extent that she's boasting in her interviews that she's put India back on a different growth trajectory, and I'm using that word boast deliberately, she's going to be proven wrong.
Most probably. I mean, I think there is an implicit recognition, and the economic survey is hinting at that really, at the moment, somewhere around 6.3, 6.5 is all we can really expect. That may be the best you can expect.
And that's after this tax relief.
After all of this, yes. Which I think is a recognition of the reality. The problem is, what is your diagnosis? You can't stop at saying that the private sector isn't investing. You can't stop at saying that consumers are not consuming enough. The question is why? And what have we done to change anything?
And that question takes you straight to the deeper question: what has caused the slowdown in growth? Is it cyclical? Is it structural? And to the extent to which it is structural, has this budget taken the right steps to tackle the problem?
Well, let's get this out of the way, because a lot of people are talking about cyclical and structural. The real question that you have to ask is, what is the benchmark against which you're evaluating the growth? If the benchmark is 6.5%, then what you are seeing is a slowdown which is structural, which means it's going to stay for a while, with the 5.4 footprint that we just got in the last quarter being the cyclical part of it. But this overall belief that we are going to be growing at 7.5%, 8%, and coming down to this 6.5%.
And then bouncing back.
It's not going to bounce back. So we are going to be 6.5%. We've got a cyclical component which is taking us to below 5.5%. We may crawl back upwards again.
But we're going to be stuck at 6.5% or 6% for a long time to come.
Until the core issues which are holding up consumption and private investment are sorted out.
What are those core issues?
One doesn't really know, but I suspect it really has to do with confidence. At the end of the day, both of these elements depend upon the level of confidence people have about their futures. It's true of investors, it's true of consumers.
And that confidence level is very low at the moment.
That confidence level is low.
That leads me to a connected question. Viksit Bharat. The economic survey has made it crystal clear that India needs at least 10 consecutive years of 8% growth. At the moment, we're struggling to even ensure we can get to 6.5%. It's quite possible, if the economic survey is correct, that next year we may be at just 6.3 and maybe even lower, because the economic survey often overestimates the performance.
Right.
So has anything been done in this budget that will put us firmly on the road to Viksit Bharat?
Well, Karan, this is the thing. Just the budgetary numbers in and of themselves do not give this indication. That, as I said, is pretty much business as usual. We will hang around the 6 to 6.5% range. Right? The real question is what the finance minister made a lot of announcements about how they are revising the way India does business. The devil is in the details. So what are these regulatory changes that she's talking about? How are they going to play out? Will the bureaucracy allow it to happen? All of those are as yet unknown. But that is where we have to look at what she is deciphering as the nature of the problem and what is she planning to do about it. It's not in the budget numbers per se.
You're referring to such things as the high-level committee on regulation that is supposed to be set up, to the export promotion mission, to the national manufacturing mission, to prospects even for a new Jan Vishwas bill.
Yes.
All of these will take perhaps a year and more to actually tell us what they're about.
Well, number one, so if you think about the commission, the Regulatory Reforms Commission, it will take them probably a year to get a report out. They've got a lot to cover. But it's going to take even longer to implement those. Look, the institutional structure of the bureaucracy is such that these things take time to play out. There is a lot of internal resistance. Now, I've been a part of the bureaucracy. I know how this works.
But two things follow from what you're saying. One, even if these are the right steps to take, it could take a year or two before we know the end result of these steps. Secondly, we will then be not 22 years away from Viksit Bharat, which is what we are at the moment, but possibly just 20. And we'll need at that stage many more years of 8% regular growth.
Look, in any case, you need 20 years of 8% growth.
We might need even higher growth if we're losing those.
That's right.
In which case, Viksit Bharat, even though she's taking what look like the right steps now, because those steps will take time to yield, could be getting further and further away.
Yes.
You agree?
Yeah, of course. But the point is, I am less concerned about becoming Viksit Bharat on a particular date. I mean, that is symbolic at best. The real question is, will things get better here and now? And therefore, it does matter as to how the government is proposing to address the issue of lack of confidence of private investment and consumers. That is at the heart of it.
Let's then, at this point, turn to the other aspects of the budget to see whether this question of confidence is better tackled in those other areas. Now, the Finance Minister identified agriculture as one of the four engines of the economy. She's announced a Dhan Dhanya Krishi Yojana, which could affect the lives of up to 17 million farmers, and a special mission for pulses, and a fairly considerable enhancement in credit for farmers. Is this combined package for agriculture going to increase confidence, boost consumption, boost demand?
No, I mean, I couldn't find anything really new in any of this.
You mean it's more of the same?
It's pretty much more of the same.
So in other words, she's talked it up. She's made it seem like an engine of growth, but she hasn't actually kick-started the engine.
Yeah, so we've had these kinds of programs many, many, many times in the past. Okay, the question is, what else is new?
And you don't find very much new?
I haven't looked at these details yet.
But it sounds like
more of the same. But it sounds like more of the same.
So in other words, this engine is not going to be firing in a big way?
No, it will continue to plug along as it has, around 3% growth.
The second engine that she identified was MSMEs. As she pointed out herself in her budget speech, they account for 36% of manufacturing, 45% of exports. And here she's spoken of a beneficial reclassification of MSMEs, a national manufacturing mission, 1.5 lakh crore additional credit, and a particular focus on labor-intensive areas like food processing, footwear, leather, tourism, toys. What impact will that have on the critical MSME sector?
again, the real question is, what is it that you're proposing to do to enable MSMEs to come into existence and thrive? You have to understand the nature of MSMEs. MSMEs are usually focused on very localized markets. And there is a growth dynamic within these localized markets. So just addressing MSMEs by saying that I'm going to help them do this, that, or the other isn't really enough. It has to be situated in the kind of economic development we are seeing in the country.
And that's not visible in this budget.
It cannot be. Remember, the central government can affect what is happening on the demand side by two things. One is through the investments it makes. But the central government investments are usually large projects which do not benefit MSMEs. They're usually done by corporates. The second way of doing it is actually to do income distribution changes to enhance consumer demand, which hopefully then the MSMEs will be able to take advantage of. The third way is to lean on the banks. So that's not directly, but the government can lean on the banks to ease loans to MSMEs. Now earlier, Karan, the finance minister had actually given a guarantee for working capital loans to MSMEs by banks. This was done last year. A good step. The real question is, it doesn't help new MSMEs. Where do they get the funds from? Will the banks lend to them? Can the government do something about it?
All of that is not known as yet.
All of that is not known as yet.
Which means, once again, as in the situation of agriculture, you don't see any major difference happening to the future of MSMEs.
It may well be, because all of these sort of non-fiscal changes that she's talking about, one would really need to see exactly what is being done.
And that will take time to tell.
That will take time to, sometimes you don't even get to hear about it.
So once again, like agriculture, there are question marks. We just don't know.
Well, I mean, you take this focus on manufacturing, right? Make in India was about manufacturing. And that was a flagship. I mean, it wasn't just a budget announcement. Make in India was a flagship program. And during the course of Make in India, in here, the share of manufacturing has fallen in GDP.
Very considerably.
Yeah.
Down to 12% apparently.
Yeah. About 2.5% of GDP has gone down. So, yes, a focus on manufacturing is important. The point is, how are you going to be different from what you've been doing up to now?
And as I said, that wasn't clear in the case of agriculture.
It's not clear here.
It's not clear in the case of MSMEs.
Yeah.
So we can't expect major changes in either. We'll carry on as we have been.
We will carry on. And our only hope is that, the MSMEs have always shown dynamism until and unless the government did something silly to wreck that. I mean, you had demonetization, then you had the lockdown, two huge body blows. So long as you don't do something like that, just the inherent entrepreneurial dynamism of the Indian MSME sector gives one some hope.
The internal dynamism of the MSME sector will keep them chugging along.
We hope.
We hope.
We hope.
In which case, let me ask you this, because to a lot of people, what matters is jobs. Will this budget, will the steps in terms of agriculture, MSMEs, the unprecedented income tax relief, will any of those measures create additional jobs for the 7 or 8 million people who enter the labor market every year? Are job prospects for people going to improve?
Well, agriculture in and of itself should not be seen as a source of jobs. As it is, we have too many people in agriculture, and the latest report where the number of people employed in agriculture is going up is actually deeply worrying. We need to get people out of agriculture.
And it's gone up fairly substantially by almost 4%.
Almost 4%, 4% of about 400 million people is a tiny, you need to find jobs for them as well, not just the 7 or 8 million you're talking about. And this is across the board. So the number of jobs that need to be created is pretty high. It's much higher than the 7 to 8 million that you're talking about.
Has the economy's potential to create those jobs improved as a result of this budget?
We don't know, because if the MSMEs do continue to grow strongly, then yes, because that's where the employment gets generated. And MSME growth, particularly manufacturing MSME growth, has a lot of spin-offs in terms of jobs in the service sectors. So yes, there is potential, but everything depends on what the MSMEs do. Do the MSMEs have the confidence to make investments? They've started doing so, and I mentioned this earlier, but it has to be sustained.
And the big problem is that the MSMEs are once again dependent upon the internal dynamism of that sector.
Yes.
There's no great visible sign that the government is adding to that dynamism by the steps that it's proposed. We just don't know.
We just don't know.
Which leads me finally to the key question about investment, private sector investment. Will it increase in all areas across the economy as a result of the impetus to demand and consumption because of the income tax relief that she's given, or will it only increase in those areas where there's a middle class spending boost?
The latter. Yes.
So limited areas only?
Limited areas, and these again would be essentially the corporates. Right? And the corporates are in still no mood to invest, simply because the expansion in the corporate sector usually does need a supportive global economy. And you're not going to get that for a while. There's going to be too much uncertainty. So I think corporate investments will be muted. In fact, may go down a little bit rather than go up. The real question is, will there be enough trickle down to get the MSMEs moving again? And my fear is that this cut that has taken place in the social services, and therefore the consumption of the poorer sections, may lead to a situation where the localized MSMEs actually face demand pressure.
So the tax relief could actually work against the interests of what you call localized MSMEs.
Yes.
Far from adding to demand,
Adding to that.
it could add to demand pressure.
Yes.
This is another component that flows directly from the income tax relief. It could actually...
Well, no, it doesn't flow directly.
Well, it's an implication of it because she's got social measures.
I mean, let's be very clear. You're cutting the fiscal deficit by 4.5%. Right? Now, you're doing so by a certain amount of increase in taxes and a certain compression of expenditures. This was going to happen anyway. Now what you've done is, to this, you've added the income tax cut, which means that your revenues have come down, which then in turn means you have to cut your other expenditures far more significantly.
I didn't mean component, I meant consequence.
Yeah.
It's a consequence of it.
It's a consequence. It's an add-on to something that would have happened. You're just making it worse.
So, one section of what you call localized MSMEs could actually be facing problems.
Yes, it depends on how it plays out.
So, we have a very complicated budget, one that provides good news for people like you and me, We could be considerably richer because of the fact that the tax impact has gone down. But it could provide a very different picture for people lower down, whose capacity to upward mobility has diminished. It could provide a very different picture to localized MSMEs who could find that they face demand pressure, not increased demand.
That's right.
And there could also be greater uncertainty, which means that the international situation might work against our desire to spend. Yes. We might become more cautious. And to the extent to which the richer elements do spend, it might be imports they go in for, because the import tariff has also come down. It's a very complicated picture, but it's not necessarily going to lead to increased demand and better growth.
I have serious doubts, yes.
Serious doubts. So when the Prime Minister calls the budget a force multiplier, when Piyush Goyal calls it transformational, to what extent do you agree? To what extent do you disagree with that choice of adjective?
Well, you couldn't expect them to say anything different, could you now?
You're saying take it with a pinch of salt.
No, I mean, look, this is a cabinet decision. This is not just the finance minister. When the Prime Minister says force multiplier, right? Presumably he has in mind a force that already exists. I have a problem seeing what that force is.
It's invisible.
Well, the only forces we are seeing are forces which are bringing us down towards 6% and maybe even sub 6%.
We don't want to multiply those.
We don't want to multiply that trend. But I would really like to know what he sees as the force that is going to be taking us forward.
A force multiplier, the problem is, where's the force that's going to multiply?
And which direction?
And in which direction? Professor Sen, thank you very much for your insights and for your invaluable explanation of all the implications and complications of the unprecedented income tax relief and how it will play out over the next year. I'm deeply grateful.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.